My guest today is the creator of the Tale of the Manticore podcast.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have another fantastic interview coming right up. But first, if you could help out the podcast in some way, I would greatly appreciate it. If you could like, rate, review, or subscribe to the podcast, those things help the show out immensely, and I would greatly appreciate it. Also, if you would like to support the show financially, you can do so at patreon.com/dicegeeks. I would love for you to join my other awesome patrons. Also, you can check out my RPG resource books at amazon.com, drivethrurpg.com, or my own website, dicegeeks.com. They help game masters cut down their prep time and have more fun at the table. You can search for the Book of Random Tables. I have 17 of those as I am recording today, but it is a growing collection of random tables that help game masters fill in details on the fly without spending hours and hours in prep. I also have books of dungeon maps, dungeon seed ideas, so you can always have a dungeon at the ready. All right, guys, but enough of all that stuff. Here's today's interview. My guest today is the creator behind the Tale of the Manticore podcast, Jon Cohen. Jon, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, Matt. It's great to be talking to you again after about a year and a bit, I think.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, it's been a little bit. So now, since in the first episode, we talked all about your RPG history, and I think we talked about why there are so many comedy podcasts or something.
Right. I had a weird hang up back then. I think I'm okay. I'm better now.
You're better now?
I'm better now, yeah.
Okay, I'm probably worse, but no, I don't know. Yeah, it's just every once in a while you can kind of get into a mood and then you realize maybe you're a little uptight or something. But I did want to ask, how have things changed on your end with your podcast, The Tale of the Manticore?
They've changed and they've grown and they've developed so much. So for any of your listeners that aren't familiar with the show or didn't catch our last interview, just really briefly, I'll explain what it is, but real briefly. So the podcast is like a hybrid. It's an experiment. It's an experiment in fiction. So it's like a hybrid between a dark fantasy audio drama and a actual old school D&D game. So I use like BX, basic expert mechanics, and I tell a story like in audio drama or radio show kind of style with the sound effects and all the rest of it. But there's no story that's pre-written. It's all generated procedurally, just like a real game. And so it's narrated in third person, and with but every now and then I'll interrupt the story with dice rolls. And so that was the sort of the big idea behind the podcast when I launched it. But when we first talked, I was only, I guess, a couple of months in, maybe 3 months in. And I was really just sort of feeling out the territory because really not a lot of people are doing that kind of thing. Even in the last year and a bit since we last spoke, I've only found maybe a half a dozen things that are comparable. Probably the highest profile would be Me, Myself, and Die. Are you familiar with that one, Trevor Duvall?
Yeah, absolutely. He actually reviewed some of my books. He did reviews on the books of Random Tables. So that was really awesome.
Actually, I think that might be where I first heard your name is by watching his show on YouTube. And for anybody that hasn't heard his show, Me, Myself, and I, it's all amazing. Like it's fantastic. And I discovered him after I started. So he's not doing exactly what I'm doing, but it's a similar species, I think, because he's making it up as he goes, and he rolls dice to kind of find out what's happening in the story and just kind of continues the story from there. He uses the Mythic engine, which I really love. Actually, I'm fascinated by it, but I don't use it. I just kind of make stuff up as a DM would in a game. So I kind of wear all the hats.
I had not heard of him until I think he popped up in an alert I have, for my role playing game books, and so he uses my random table sometimes to fill out dungeon rooms and things like that, which is like super cool because is
super cool. Yeah.
I know he is like legit.
Yes. Oh, he's so talented.
Yes.
Not just as a DM, but he's also a professional voice actor, and he's got some like video editing chops. So. His production values are distressingly high. Like for anybody who's making, competing for eyeballs and ears, distressingly good at what he does. Yeah,
absolutely. I know. I listened to a few, and his voices are incredible. And yes, absolutely, he sets a high bar of production. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, that is fascinating, and I know we talked a little about your podcast before. Since it is quite different. That you don't have a cast instead of, some actual play that actually has, like 5-6, players. Yeah. You're just creating it on your own.
Right.
What kind of, maybe what kind of challenges does that pose to you, and how do you overcome them? If you're the player, how do you not just remember you're the game master?
Yeah. I think there's, It provides some opportunities, and there are also some things that are lost. Like on the pro side, everyone always shows up to my games. That's nice, right?
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, you never have to cancel a session unless you want to. Yeah.
That's right. There's no scheduling problems. There are no members of the team that kind of are bad at role playing. At least I hope that's that is the hope. If one is, they all are.
Yeah,
I'll say that. But so sometimes I do get a conflict between like what a DM would know and what players would know. And so that, I guess, would be the primary conflict when you're doing solo role play. And there's a few ways that you could address that. And one would be to use like a mythic oracle, right? Like Trevor Duvall does. And I'm surprised at how rarely this issue comes up. It actually, you'd think it would happen all the time, that there would be this conflict between what players would know and what the DM would know. And if that's all the same person, then you got a problem. Oddly, it really rarely comes up. Like I'm on episode, I guess I'm doing, I think I've published 52 of them, and I'm sort of in the playing stage on episode 59. And I think maybe this problem has come up in a meaningful way, maybe 3 times. And one of them was because I did like a puzzle, and like I really made that problem for myself. It was really a roadblock that I was just like lifted up and put it right in front of me. But all of that is part of this experiment in fiction that I'm trying to do. I'm like, I want to know like how can this be addressed as a solo player in a satisfying way that feels fair to me as a player, me as a DM, and now that I know that there's a few people out there listening, to anybody, I would want the game to feel like this is fair. This is dealt with fairly. So my most extreme answer, it was for the puzzle, was I got in touch with another podcaster and I said, hey, will you drive my players for half a day? Don't get them killed or anything like that. But I have this puzzle and I just want to know, like, how would somebody address it who doesn't know the answer? And so I just emailed somebody who I trusted and said, hey, will you drive the bus for, just a few hours and tell me your thoughts on how you would address this. And then I'll just weave it into the narrative. And that's how I dealt with that. And it worked just fine. Like it should, you'd think it'd be a bigger problem, but it's just not. You'd think like, well, how about a secret door? How about a poison needle in a chest? These things, occur all the time in D&D. And if you're the player and you're the DM, how how are you going to deal with that conflict of information? Who's got it? Who doesn't? And it's just not tough. You just think, okay, well, there's poison needles in chests in D&D. Here's a chest. Put a poison needle in it, and the character won't know, and they will try and open it. And so I just basically I lead my characters into danger constantly, and then sometimes with dire effects, and sometimes with really unexpected and exciting story events come out of these situations. So I'm maybe a little harder on the characters. Maybe that's so that anybody that's listening is going to feel like, well, that was fair. I mean, that he certainly didn't coddle the characters because they're his characters, that kind of thing. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And I know, just years ago, when I was a teenager or whatever, I would, especially a young teenager, I would, play by myself. Uh-huh. And if you let the dice tell the story, mm-hmm. and you're honest about it, you really can do it.
You really can, and it's rich. It's richer than you would expect. Yeah. The game that I'm playing now is, I think it's it's the richest game of D&D I've ever played. Is that sad?
Yeah. But well, yeah. And I think, though, you pointed out that a puzzle is the biggest challenge, right? Like if it's like, arrange the gemstones by color or something. It's like, well, I already know that, how do you get that, how do you set that apart? So I think you kind of hit on kind of the toughest one there.
Right.
It's just the puzzle or the riddle, right? The door has a riddle on it. Well, I'm the game master. I made up the riddle. So,
I could have easily just not put that in there and just had something else.
Yeah.
But exactly. I thought, this, I want to go for that classic feel. Mm-hmm. So I want the classic monsters. I want all the classic tropes. And, a riddle is that's a classic trope of RPGs. And I just wanted to have one.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely understand that. And I think one way I would do it sometimes is I'd, roll an intelligence roll or something. And if they failed, they couldn't figure it out or something like that. But it does seem, that is probably the hardest part. It's just, and then, of course, I mean, I don't know. I never did it, for an audience. So I don't know how, you really handle it for an audience to really try to pull people along. Are what kind of maybe techniques are you using to really kind of help pull people into the story?
I try and use the writer's toolbox. So one thing that we talked about, sort of like there's a give and a take for the way I'm doing the game. One of the things that I can take is that I can use the writer's toolbox in the way that a DM at a table can't. So I can use flashbacks quite easily, where I think using flashbacks and jumping around in time in a D&D game is rare. Maybe, to be generous, it's rare. I don't know if I've ever really seen that happen, but super rare and difficult to do. But for a writer, it's quite easy. Also, I can change the POV, and I can go and see what the antagonist is doing for 5 minutes. Whereas in a D&D game, again, usually you don't abandon your players and have them stop and tell a different story. But I realized kind of early on, probably about the same time that we were talking when we met, I realized, there are a bunch of things that I can be taking advantage of, like author's tricks. And I can bring those into the game in ways that other actual plays can't do. And then the very biggest one, which is, I guess, my secret weapon, is that most actual plays, they have to improvise. So whatever people think of off the dome, that's what they go with. Yeah. But if you're playing it solo, you don't have to do that, because your first idea is often not your best idea. And so if I come up with a problem, I can stop and go and have a walk or go and take a shower or go to work. I could spend a week thinking about a problem, and I'm going to come up with a much better solution than an improvised one. The same goes with dialogue. Instead of whatever's off the top of my head that might be corny or contain errors, like continuity errors or whatever, I can really give it some thought. And so for me, that is the very best thing. That's the biggest advantage that I have over other actual plays, is that I can really put thought into what I'm doing. And countless times something has occurred to me that I would not have thought of, like on the fly. And, some mistake that I was about to make, some detail that long forgotten, that if I bring it in now, that could be very dramatic and interesting. And so that's the kind of thing that rarely happens in games, unless you've got some very talented, very, very sharp players. I'm none of those things. I need that time to think of the good ideas.
Yeah. I think it's a screenwriting quote from, I think it's Aaron Sorkin. He said something like, dialogue is just normal conversation if you had 10 minutes to think about what you said, or something, or what
that's
you're
really
going to say.
It's like if you've ever had an argument with somebody, or almost been in a fight or something like that, and then like you say something and you realize like a day later what you should have said.
Yeah.
That would have been way more badass. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I find too, like if you, I think it's just true if you're playing, say, a weekly game, or, some years ago we were playing a monthly game, and if you paused, if it got to our deadline, whatever it was, midnight or whatever, and that was our deadline, and we paused the session, the next time we picked up, the players had they just pulled out some awesome stuff.
Yes, exactly.
Hour or two. Well, why? They thought about it on their lunch break for 2 weeks or whatever it was, and they thought about it. And then they were just like, oh, I'm doing this on my turn right when we start. And that first hour or so is just like, oh my gosh, that's awesome, because they had time to think about it. Yeah.
So this is what I experienced. That again, when I started out doing this, I would not have considered any of this, mostly because I'd never done it before, and I didn't really know what I was getting into, and I didn't know if it would survive 10 episodes, because it could have fallen apart in whatever way I didn't foresee. So I'm kind of amazed at how coherent it's been, and how very much like a game it is, actually.
I don't know. I mean, there's so much going on in the whole, I don't know what to call it, podcasting space or whatever. Yeah. But I mean, I think not only with role-playing games, with others as well. But I mean, I think we're seeing that we're pushing storytelling to new levels and to new places, that people are doing, news like podcasts, and people are doing fiction podcasts, and people are doing whatever, slice of, life kind of podcasts. People are doing all kinds of things. And we're really just pushing storytelling, because so many people now just have access to the medium, really. Yeah, exactly. It really is the medium that's driving it. It's not like, the audio medium's been around, but I don't think people, like the public, didn't have access to the means to produce it as we do now. So now you've got so many ideas coming out, and it's like, I think it's mutating the art form in a way, which is really what I'm deliberately doing, is just trying to do something weird and different. And I thought, this new life form might not survive. So I'm really thrilled to see that it just grows and grows. It's amazing. And now I'm thinking about season 2. Yeah, that's awesome. And I think it is strange, because, we've had actually the ability for some time to record, like an audio show or something. Cause I remember, me and a buddy of mine, say, something like 8th grade or something, we had our little tape recorders and stuff, and we would tape something, and we'd tape like a show, like we were pretending to be like a radio show or the morning DJs or something. Yeah. But what was missing? We couldn't show it to anybody. We couldn't have anybody listen to it.
Yeah, the distribution wasn't there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it was just like, oh well, we got it on a tape, like one tape, and we could I don't know, loan it to somebody. I like what? Like, and now, I mean, you could just, distribution is not an issue, right? You can just get it all over the place. So I think that is, it is really fascinating. So why don't you tell us, you told us a little about it, and then you just kind of teased right there. You got a season 2 coming up. What kind of, some stuff do you think you have coming in season 2? So I don't have an arc, but I do because it's because my show is like a regular game. My characters are advancing in level, and so one of two things will happen. They're either going to die, and then I'll start season 2, or they'll kind of level out. And because I'm not just going to keep going and going, I don't feel like D&D scales particularly well, especially basic expert. I'm up to about level 9. I feel is good, and then they'll sort of be done. And I think that'll be the end. And if my characters survive and succeed, they'll retire. Kind of like if you're familiar with those basic and expert books, they kind of suggest that that's what happens. You get a stronghold and you become a lord or whatever. Yeah. So for season 2, I think I want to keep in my world and keep in my lore and my canon. But I'd like to switch the tone and the environment a lot, because the story that I'm telling right now, it by total random dice rolls, it ended up becoming a story about dwarves. I have no special interest in dwarves as a race, or they're fine. It's not one I typically go for as a player if I'm at a table. But this is just where the dice pushed my story, and eventually the investment in the story was too far for it to leave, because it's not just a bunch of random disjointed events. Like a real campaign, things stick together. And so, anyway, long story short, it became the story of a bunch of dwarves. And I asked a lot of people, people familiar with the show will know that I ask a lot of people to come and do like a guest voice cameo on my show. Actually, Trevor Duvall did one for me a little while ago, and it's one of my favorite episodes that he did, because he's just so talented. And I got to fanboy a little bit when he did that for me. Anyway, almost everybody who does a voice for my show ends up voicing a dwarf, because that's the environment that we're in. And Ben of Lawful Great Adventures always jokes that I have a secret, it's a conspiracy theory that I have a secret agenda to turn everybody in the RPG verse into a dwarven character eventually. And he's probably not wrong. It's not by design, but there's probably 20 or 25 people that have voiced a dwarf for me at some point. So anyway, season 2, I'm thinking not dwarves. That's I'm thinking probably urban, not urban, but medieval city environment to begin with. Yeah. And another thing is because my story went into the lore of the dwarves, and boy, it's been richer and a better ride than I ever would have thought possible, or more interesting to me. To sort of keep the verisimilitude, I've tried to keep my voice actors with North American accents. I figured if everybody has a totally different accent, it will, jostle that suspension of disbelief in a way that wouldn't be good. So I couldn't always stick with it, especially in the beginning of the podcast, when I was really just begging anyone to do a voice and taking anyone that said yes. But as the show kind of grew and grew, I was able to pick and choose a little bit more. And so I would approach people that had a North American accent and say, okay, in my world, dwarves have a North American accent. Would you play a dwarf? Anyway, the upshot is that a lot of UK listeners that
have expressed an interest or that I would like to go after to do a voice, I can't do that because of my own sort of decision to try and keep it consistent. And so I thought, okay, in season 2, I'd like to at least find a way to include like British accents because I've almost like squared off and ruled out a whole segment of really great talent that I want to use it so bad, but it won't fit what I'm doing right now. So I'm thinking in season 2, I'll make a certain area of my world and say, okay, here we have British accents.
Are the elves going to have British accents? Is that what
the elves are another one? Actually, I did, and again, all randomly, I did have an elf show up, one of them, in my campaign, and I thought, well, I'll do something different, and I'll make them a little bit more like wild, less Tolkien-esque, and more like an elf quest kind of elf. And so I had them do a voice that was kind of I don't even know what the accent was, but the voice actress who did it for me was wonderful. She really nailed it, and I almost had them like kind of struggling with the quote unquote common tongue. It was interesting. I think that would be a very, very tough decision if I got into like the lore of the elves, just because I find that is one race where it's very hard for me to imagine like what does a community look like, and make it really believable, because I'm making this dark fantasy audio drama, so it can't be like they live on walkways in the trees. Like, no, that's not believable to me. And they can't be sort of like perfect shining silver people, because that's maybe a little too derivative. So I don't know. That would be, I think, the greatest challenge, and I'm not ready for that. We'll say maybe season 3 we'll go there once I'm really a veteran.
Okay. Well, I did want to follow up on something you mentioned before. Now, obviously, a lot of the people who are listening to the podcast are not podcasters themselves, and they're running their games for their friends or people online. You mentioned something about the writer's toolkit and using different things, and of course, we talked about how you have time to think about things instead of just coming up with things on the fly, kind of. What are some things do you think from the writer's toolkit, like that a GM who is coming up with things on the fly after, say, like a long day at work, craziness with family and kids or something, and then now they're expected to come up with like Tolkien and Shakespeare on the fly. How can a GM or a DM take some of the writer's toolkit and kind of learn that and then use it on the fly while they're improvising?
I'm not going to be able to answer from experience, because the pandemic has mean that my actual like group games have been very few, and in actually most of them I've been playing and not DMing. I have DM'd a couple of times during the pandemic over Zoom and stuff, but I don't know about you, but I find that playing online is, for me, it's not very satisfying. I know some people like it more. I guess it's all a matter of taste. But I've done it only a little bit. But let's see. Off the top of my head, I'm sure that there are at least 2 or 3 things that people could pull out of like a writerly toolbox to work with. For me, one of my favorite things to work with is dramatic irony. So if you can ever find a way to have the audience know what's going on, but not the players. So I think that if you're just talking about a game, that could be tough. I think because the audience and the players are the same people, right? So you'd have to work that through NPCs, right? Where something is going to happen to an NPC and they're not aware of it, but the players are. I'm trying to come up with an example on the fly, and it's not coming to me. But I'm sure that there is some way that you could introduce, something's going to happen to this NPC. They don't even know that it's going to happen, but now you do, and there's a ticking clock or something like that. Actually, speaking of ticking clocks, that's one trick I think that is an easy one to use. It's not necessarily from a writer's box of tools, but it's a good one to make sure that like there's motivation. Okay, I think I talked myself back onto the path now, and I know I have an answer for you. It took me a minute to get there, but okay. I think if we were looking at like how to motivate characters, and I deal with this in my show, and I think applies to games as well. But like, why are the players adventuring? Why are they out there doing what they're doing? If there's danger around, and maybe if they find a big bag of money, why would they not just retire at the age of 23 and be like done? Like, why in the world would they ever like be like, we should go into another dungeon and risk our lives because no, we're already rich. Why? And so there has to be motivating factors. And so this really is, I think, a writer's trick is to have as many of these factors as possible. And when you can, have something that's like pulling the characters forward, like there is a goal that they have to get to. And if you can also put something behind them that's pushing, so much the better. So that could be like they're being pursued. Mm-hmm. So like for me, the ideal situation is that the characters have a ticking clock, they have to get somewhere, and they're being pursued all at the same time. And so that gives characters a reason to be moving. Mm-hmm. Always. And so I think that that's something that as a DM, and again, when I'm playing live games, usually I'm there as a player, but as a DM, I want pushing and pulling and a countdown. I want all that stuff happening. And I want the times where the characters can rest and feel safe to be short, and I want them to be interrupted.
Well, I have a number of things there I'd like to follow up on because it's interesting. I just did an interview recently with John Walsh, who is an award-winning filmmaker and mm-hmm. author, and we talked about his new book about Escape from New York, and how John Carpenter put in the 24-hour clock on Snake's wrist, which he totally had admitted that he stole from High Noon, the Gary Cooper Western, because in High Noon, right, you only have 4 hours or whatever it is. I think it's 4 hours until noon, and every shot has a clock in it, right? Every shot has a clock in it until you get to noon, and that is just building up that kind of tension there. So I think that is definitely something that can be used occasionally to really drive home things. And then you were talking about like the dramatic irony. I think there is some, and I hate to get into the idea of, like people say, oh, well, a good game master will do this or a good player will do this or something. But like if your players are really playing their characters and they're not, not using a lot of, metagaming. If they're not doing that and they're pretty good, I'm going to say they're pretty good because everybody breaks it at some point. And if they're pretty good, you can definitely introduce some things like that.
That's true. That's true.
To where, everybody at the table knows something, but your players are just like heading down this, this dark path or something. And you're just like, why are we doing this? I know we shouldn't be doing this, but we're doing it. Right. And so every once in a while you can, do that. And that's really good. I think too, though, some ways to introduce that, I think, I don't have a great example off the top of my head, just to keep that, player knowledge and character knowledge kind of apart. But I think sometimes, even if it isn't like kind of spelled out and they know it for a long time, I think sometimes you can use, sometimes players, they'll jump into a situation and they'll commit to a series, of actions without thinking through some things, right, that you can then spring on them later. A lot of times players, if they're involved in something shady and they make a deal with like the crime boss or something and then they leave. Right. they never check to see if they're followed, right? Like
Right.
I have only had like one person, be like, "Oh, are we being followed?" And it's just like, okay, well, you just gave me something, right? And you're being followed, but nobody's checking. And then I can reveal later that they've been followed, and that, and if they think, oh, well, you just didn't give us a chance to do that, and you're just like, no, all you had to do was roll 14 on perception or something. And you would have known you would have been followed or something. So I think that's an interesting way to sometimes, kind of use, something to surprise the players a little bit with. But then, I was thinking, this is something that I think about, we were talking about podcasts, but also actual play, right, is becoming very, very popular in video, right?
Yes.
So, 73 to 80,000 people every Thursday night watch Critical Role for 4 hours, right? So on Twitch, that is impressive.
To say the least. Yeah.
To say the least, right? Seeing as how, I would take a fraction of that listening to my podcast and I would be overjoyed. But what I've always found interesting, and I don't know why people haven't done this, yet, and so I'm going to give it away. But it's not like it's even that secret. But it's like, why don't they have a camera on the dice? Like, why don't they have a camera behind the DM screen? And when they roll, the DM rolls, and it's a nat 1 or a nat 20 or something like this. You could be showing that to the audience. And the audience would lose their minds.
They would lose their minds. I totally get this. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So like, I don't understand exactly, because, Critical Role or even what is Acquisitions Incorporated or definitely have the budget for it, right? Like there's no budget problem. You could just have a camera focused on everybody's dice at the table, right?
Yep.
And I don't know why people aren't doing that. Because
Trevor Duvall does it. Just to come back to him again, he does have a dice cam, and you know what? He uses it all the time. The show wouldn't be the same without it. So I'm completely on board, and I think you're right. They should do that.
Yeah. It's just some of the ones recently that I have looked at haven't done that. And especially like Critical Role or, Acquisitions Incorporated or whatever. It's just, if you showed the role and you showed it to the audience before the players knew what it was, the audience would just be glued to the screen.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking about, the D&D movie that's, I guess it's coming out sometime. I don't know. I don't pay attention to this kind of press, but so they're making this D&D movie.
Yeah.
They've never ever made a good one. So my expectation is that this will be awful. And so part of my brain this last year has been kind of every now and then it'll come back to like, I wonder how they could reimagine the D&D movie so that it wouldn't suck. And I keep having this idea like, what if they took an actual play? Sure, we'll say it's Critical Role. And then instead of hiring someone to write a script, they use this emergent story and present that as the movie. So they would basically have, a bunch of people play a game and then maybe even show roles in the movie, like have a meta layer, I guess, in the movie, which would show the roles, and so make it a hybrid between a game and a movie, and so that would feel like D&D. I think one of the problems with D&D movies, aside from bad actors and bad special effects and a lot of cheese, is that D&D games don't follow like a 3-act structure, and so the movies don't feel like a game ever. They're like, oh well, I recognize these images. That's a dragon and there's a knight, but this doesn't seem like any game I've ever played, and so this doesn't feel like D&D. So why is this a D&D movie? Anyway, that's kind of a thought that's rolled around in my head. Like, it would be interesting if they took an actual play approach to making a movie, which would, I'm sure, have a lot of challenges, but like I know it can be done.
Just thinking about it, like, has there actually been like a good movie based on a video game, right? Like,
Right.
Nothing spectacular. Maybe Resident Evil are some of the best franchise kind of movies about it. But with all of the video games that are out there and all of the video game movies that have been made, it's just like they have something of the world, but they all just lack the story, right? Because
they don't have the spirit of the game. Yeah.
They don't have the spirit of it, and D&D, you know, it's just lacking the spirit of what I come to with the table. You know, it's so much more alive if you're playing with your friends and stuff than if you know, just one person or a group of screenwriters kind of come up with something. And usually, I mean, and to give some people a break, usually you have a lot of pressure, a lot of money riding on things, people who are in position who have no idea what the creative people are talking about when they say Dungeons and Dragons.
Part of the problem, but yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because I know the Dungeon and Dragon movie from the early 2000s was Courtney Solomon, who is a fanboy and basically talked his way into getting movie rights when he was like 18 years old, which is a phenomenal story, that somebody could do that. I mean, it just blows my mind, but that he could do that, and that he had the guts to just go when he's 18 and just like say, I'm going to make the movie, I'll buy the rights or whatever. And
that's ballsy. And I mean, whoever put up the venture capital for that is even ballsier.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so I was just thinking about that, and now I've had that idea too. Of course, years ago I studied screenwriting in college and I did some independent filmmaking and stuff for a while, and then I gave it up because I needed to eat food. And I didn't have that. But I always thought that like blending the table with the game would work really well. But if you talk to people, if you talk to actual screenwriters and people who actually get movies made, they're always like, no, that's terrible.
It wouldn't work. Like you're probably familiar with like Chekhov's gun. If you studied, but for your listeners, if you don't know what Chekhov's gun is, it's kind of this rule in writing that says, if there is a rifle mounted on the wall in a room in your story, that rifle needs to be fired at some point in the story. Otherwise, get it off the wall, take it out of your story. So there should be like no parts that don't serve a purpose, no kind of random rough edges in a story. But get like D&D games, all RPGs are littered with these things. And that's part of what makes them what they are. And movies are, and books and stuff are such a completely different beast. And I think that's why like the two can't seem to find this this meeting place in the middle. And then of course there's the whole idea that, plot armor, your main characters, they can't die in a movie. They they're going to win, and it's really just what clever way are they going to make them win? Like how are they going to take me on a ride we know how it ends when it starts. Yeah. Whereas again, with a game, you don't know how it will end, or if the characters will die, or what will happen.
Yeah, and I think I think Chekhov's gun has been taken to kind of absurd levels in some regard in Hollywood, because there are instances where something can be a throwaway or appear to be a throwaway, but actually create a larger world, right? When Obi-Wan says, I fought with your father in the Clone Wars, right? Like that doesn't do anything for the story. And nowadays it might be cut, which, you almost think like, I want to scream right now, right? Yes. Like you can't, right? But like, there are some things that you put in that add so much to the place, right? Like there's so much to the story, so much to the world, that leave people asking questions, right? Because the best way I heard it too is there was one producer who said a parking lot question, right? You want to have the audience walk out of the theater and go, what are the Clone Wars, man?
Right.
What are those? Or something else along those lines. And so I don't know. I don't know. I'm gonna get on a film rant, and usually, John, like I should not do that because obviously, some of my bitterness about my past experiences making independent films might might bleed into it a little bit. You might say
you don't have like a half drank bottle of whiskey beside you or anything, right? You're not going to start becoming angry, Matt.
Yeah, exactly. Or a pistol or something. Yeah, that would be ridiculous. Yes, no, nothing like that. So no, I'm not going to become angry or anything or dangerous in any stretch of the imagination. But sometimes I do get a little bitter, I guess. But and it makes it a little bit more funny if if I put kind of a bitter thing on it, because actually it's totally cool. I had a lot of fun making movies and stuff, and I have a lot of fun arguing about movies as well. So I mean, half of my enjoyment of life would be gone if I couldn't just argue and yell about movies. But it is just I don't know. It is interesting to see. Well, I guess one of the big tests is going to be the Critical Role animated series, right? That they kickstarted for like millions and millions and millions of dollars. That is just going to, I believe, just tell the story of their campaign again, which is kind of fascinating. That's going to be kind of one of the flagships of role playing, that it's going to be a Critical Role animated series instead of, say, a branded Dungeons and Dragons animated series or something like that.
I guess the game is changing. I mean, it is owned by Hasbro, so if it does become a little bit maybe more juvenile in its presentation, I guess that shouldn't be a huge surprise to us.
Well, yeah, I don't know if it's going to be juvenile. I think the cartoon's going to be like, oh, really? PG-13 or R or something like that.
Oh, so. Well, okay. Well, kudos to them then if they do that. If they make it like for a slightly more mature audience, okay. I would watch that.
Yeah, I think I'm not the most up on stuff.
I was kind of expecting a turtle in a top hat, to be honest, when I heard about it.
Well, I mean, I could go for a turtle and a top hat.
There might be one.
Yeah. But I thought it was going to at least be something like a PG-13 kind of thing.
It'll be interesting to see how they deal with violence and something like that, because again, that's a pretty standard part of the game. And if they do like the G.I. Joe cartoon approach, where there's a lot of violence but nobody ever actually gets hit, that would change things too.
Yeah, well, I think those days are over, since if you're not on broadcast television, you can kind of do whatever you want.
You can kind of do what you want.
Yeah, because those were obviously, they had the cartoon code and things in the 80s and the 90s, the early 90s, which the new code just basically killed all of children's programming. That's why we got all the live action stuff here, at least here in the States in the 90s. You got like sports shows and stuff on Saturday morning instead of like tons of cartoons, because people were like, well, what do we do? We can't kill robots or something, Yes.
Actually, the old D&D cartoon, which as a child I was obsessed with.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone ever got hurt in that, did they? They got sort of tied up with magical glowing arrows, I believe.
Yeah, I can't remember. I mean, I watched every episode of that when I was a kid, but yeah, I don't remember. I think they had to steer away from it, obviously, with some of the connotation of violence and that. And yeah, I think they got tied up or light blasted and like fell on fell on the
it's
ground or
the same GI Joe approach, right? A lot of guns being fired, nobody getting hit by guns.
Yeah, something like that. Well, as always, I managed to drag the podcast off onto some tangent and stuff, but you've kind of dipped your toe into the publishing waters. Why don't you tell us what you've published?
So, foolishly, last spring, I thought, hey, I'm going to try and put out something on Drive-Thru RPG. I know lots of other people do that. I hear people talking about their stuff. Maybe I'll try that. And I had gotten this idea, and it wouldn't leave my brain. And so I wrote it down and turned it into a set of rules. And it was kind of inspired by A Quiet Year. Do you know that one?
I do actually. I just bought it, and
it's very good.
But I don't know it very well, sadly.
It's so good. I've actually played that probably as much as I've played D&D, and it's wonderful. Like, it's really, people use the word eloquent a lot when they talk about game design, and this is really very good because they do so much with so little. And the idea is that you kind of have a world building experience. It's not even really a game. You're kind of building a history or a story, and playing cards kind of generate all of these prompts. So you'll pull a card, and the card will say, okay, I've got a 4 of clubs. You look it up on a chart, and it says somebody visits the village, and they're really good or they're really bad. You describe it, and that's kind of how the game works. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, I wonder if like a dungeon delver could work this way. So that instead of picking cards and say you enter a square room and it has a goblin in it, or you pick a card and it has a picture of a hallway on it, which is a way that some of them have worked in the past. Mm-hmm. I thought maybe a card-driven game could kind of be like The Quiet Year. And so I had this idea that you would draw a map and pick cards, and the cards would say, there is a natural sanctuary with a pool in it. Go ahead and draw that. There are 2 exits, and you could put them anywhere you wanted, and you could make it as big or small as you wanted. And then you would sort of like make this map as you went, and there would be monsters and treasure, and all of it would be randomly generated by playing cards. And I thought, well, kind of like The Quiet Year, this could be done with a group of people, but could also be done solo. So really quickly, I realized, oh, this is a game that could be played with 1 person or up to 4 players, 1 for, say, each of the main basic character classes. So you got a fighter, a cleric, and a thief, and a wizard. And when you're playing it, you could give them names, you could not. It's extremely, I guess, meta in a sense, and very, very light, like super, super, super light. I stripped out every possible like crunch mechanic that I could. I thought, I wonder if I could get rules that are sort of like an RPG that is sort of done on the fly, 0 prep, all done by drawing playing cards and rolling a few dice. And it would be like, the idea was a one-shot that could actually be done in 1 shot. That was a complaint I'd heard so many times, that people had a one-shot, but they stripped out the middle because things started to drag or they couldn't finish it. And so the game was clipped before the finale. And I thought, could we make a game that is like rules ultra light, and we have this cards mechanic that I'm going to borrow from A Quiet Year, and it could actually be done in an hour and a half. Anyway, I got this idea. I wrote down the rules. I managed to fit them into about 2 pages, I think. And so I had 2 pages of rules. Like, it's rules ultra light. It's extremely light. And then there's about, 10 pages of charts, which really basically just detail what happens when I pull a card. And at the end, there's an example of play, which it's fairly extended. I think I made that 3 pages long. So there's as much of the example of play as there is the rules. And that's kind of it. The whole thing is 18 pages long. And the feedback I've gotten has been interesting, because people have said things like, I played this with my kids and they really, really liked it. I didn't design it for kids to get into D&D, but that's definitely one of the ways that this game has found a home since I put it out there. That was a very scary experience to put it out there and then kind of wait and see if anybody would buy it. I'm sure you can, if you remember way back to when you began, you probably had a similar experience. I guess it's the same with the podcast too, right? You put it out there and you're like, I wonder if 3 people will listen to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the next week you're like, I wonder if 5 people will listen to this. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I had that. Yeah, there are some products that I've put out at the beginning where I'm just like, will anybody buy this? Will anybody buy this? So that sounds really interesting. What's it called?
It's called One Shot in the Dark. And so it's out there on DriveThruRPG, and I made it extremely cheap. So if you have any curiosity about a one-shot rules ultralight classic RPG that you could play on your own, it's $150. And actually, Matt, if you're interested, I'll email you a copy tonight when we're done talking.
Oh, that's awesome.
Just even for the sake of a peruse. Yeah. But my goal for my podcast and my goal for One Shot in the Dark, it was never to make money. I'm fortunate. I have a very stable job as a high school teacher in Canada, and they actually treat us okay. Maybe during a pandemic, a little less than okay, but I'm not. This isn't my livelihood, and so I thought, well, I'll just make it super super cheap, and that way, like the people that email me and say, hey, your podcast doesn't have a Patreon, is there any way I can support you, because I like what you're doing? I started getting more and more and more emails like that, and so I thought, this is what I'm going to do. Instead of somebody using like a coffee.com or a Patreon or a tip jar, I'll just put out an actual game, and then if people want to support my show, they can buy the game, and then they'll actually get the game too, and then I can feel like I've really given them like a lot of value.
Yeah, that sounds awesome. And so I will definitely make sure that I put a link to One Shot in the Dark in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening right now can find it very easily in the show notes for this episode.
Thanks.
Yeah, no problem. And well, Jon, I've had you on here now for a long time. We've been chatting. I tried to derail it into a filmking movie.
I think I may have derailed it once or twice.
Well, you're the guest, so you can definitely derail things. But why don't you just remind us again, what's your podcast? Where can people find it and hear about some dark fantasy role playing?
Great. Thanks. So the podcast is called Tale of the Manticore, and it's a hybrid audio drama dark fantasy and actual play solo BX Dungeons and Dragons game, and it's on every single podcatcher or whatever. So you can get it on Apple, you can get it on Spotify, you can get it on Podbean or Podcast Addict, all of them, Stitcher, all of them. It's even on YouTube, although I don't think a ton of people are listening on YouTube, but it's out there anyway. It's kind of everywhere. And give it a listen, because at the very least, I think it'll be something different, something that you haven't heard before. And maybe you'll find like, oh yeah, this is my thing. This is the itch that I've been trying to scratch. That's why I made it in the first place. There was something I wanted and it just didn't exist. Yeah, that's awesome. And again, I will make sure I put a link to Tale of the Manticore podcast in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So listeners can find that link very easily there. Well, Jon, it was just a pleasure to have you on the show again. Thank you so much for stopping by today. Thank you so much. And you know what? I want to make an extra special thank you, because Matt, you were either the first or the second, I can't remember. You were the first or second person to have me on as an interviewee when I started out, and you really gave me a push, and I got some listeners, and I think you kind of got my ball rolling, and I want to say thank you for that, because now I'm in a place that I wasn't expecting to have a listenership like I do, and so I feel like I owe you some thanks for that. So gratitude, my friend. Thank you very much.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jon today. As I mentioned in the show, I've provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, where you can check out Jon's podcast, Tale of the Manticore, and you definitely should. All right, now, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps, you'll never miss an episode of this show, and each and every Friday you'll get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in the world of Dice Geeks. All right, guys, I thank you so much for listening today. It is always a pleasure to come to you each and every Wednesday with an awesome guest and a conversation about role-playing games, which I love to death, and I am sure you do as well. Again, if you would like to support the show, please just like, rate, review, or subscribe. And also check out my Patreon if you would. It's just patreon.com/dicegeeks. I would greatly appreciate it, as I always say. All right, again, thank you so much. And until next Wednesday, keep gaming.